Welcome to Season 6 of the Photo Ethics Podcast. I'm your host, Savannah Dodd, and I'm the founder of the Photography Ethics Center. Each week, I'll be talking with an accomplished photographer about the ethics of their practice. This episode of the Photo Ethics Podcast is brought to you by Falmouth University, one of the UK's leading creative arts institutions. If you're a regular listener, you'll know that I'm passionate about education, especially education that is accessible. With flexible online learning through Falmouth University, you can study from anywhere, starting in January, May, or September. Join the university that has nurtured the award-winning photographers Justin Carey, who we interviewed in Season 1, and Rehab El-Dalil, who we interviewed in Season 4. Falmouth graduates have been featured in the New York Times, The Guardian, and the BBC. If you're passionate about photography and want to refine your practice, Falmouth's specialist photography courses are designed for you. Led by expert academics and industry-savvy tutors, you'll develop your critical thinking and create work that explores powerful themes on a local, national, and international scale. Search Photography at Falmouth to find out more. Today, in episode number 7, we'll be talking with Nana Kofi Acquah on the complexity of consent. Nana Kofi Acquah is a Ghanaian journalist and advertising creative director who now works as a documentary photographer and filmmaker. His work focuses on challenging perceptions of Africa, inequality, and climate change. Nana was a juror for the World Press Photo Contest in 2019 and a recipient of the Tim Hetherington Foundation and World Press Photo Fellowship. In 2016, Nana was named by Shutterstock as one of the top 100 photographers in the world to follow on social media. He's based in Accra. Could we start with you just telling us a little bit about the kind of work that you do?
What you traditionally call a documentary photographer, I think that's what I'll say. Of course, I do some editorials, I do assignments also. So sometimes I step out of genre, but I'm basically a documentary photographer. I also film. I produce documentaries, video documentaries, and not just photos.
And how did you get into photography originally?
So I used to work in radio. I started radio journalism when I was a student. But before that, I used to paint. And whilst working in radio, at some point, I felt the visual artist part of me was dying. So upon advice from a mentor, I took a job in advertising where I started as a copywriter. It was fun because then I was always in the studio with graphic designers and art directors and had a fantastic creative director. So it was whilst working in advertising that I discovered photography. And I took to it immediately because it was like a faster way to paint, because now I didn't have the time to paint. But, with a camera and a bit of creativity and composition, it was fun. And then at some point, I got so obsessed with photography. That was all I wanted to do. So I knew it was time to leave advertising. But because I got introduced to photography when I worked in advertising, all my very early work would be what you call commercial photography, the types of billboards and stuff. That was my world. But at some point I was like, well, considering that I have a journalism background and considering all the issues I have with how Africa is perceived, maybe I have to look beyond commercial photography and think more about impact. How do I get to change the narrative around Africa? So that's how I ended up in this space we today label as documentary photography.
That's really interesting to hear about that sort of transition across different forms of media and different forms of visual arts. And I'm sure all of that has really informed your practice today as well. I mean, I guess I'm kind of curious, how do you find your experience in painting? How does that sort of inform the type of photography that you do?
I think that painting and photography are not very different. I remember somebody saying one was inclusive and the other is exclusive, in the sense that with painting, you begin with a blank canvas and you decide, you are very intentional about what you put on the canvas. With a photograph, you begin with a frame and you have to choose what you do not put in the frame. So you exclude with photography, but you include with art. I mean, that's somebody trying to be intelligent about it, I think. But but the fundamental principles are the same, with composition, with color, with storytelling, with scale, with the politics of it, even the politics of art. Why do you paint what you paint? Of all the things you could photograph, why this? And I think those fundamental similarities won't ever change.
That's really interesting. I'm really glad I asked you that, because that was a great response.
Thank you.
And why do you photograph what you photograph? You mentioned a little bit about representation. And I guess I wonder if you could maybe talk a little bit more about why you photograph the things that you photograph.
So I photograph what I photograph because my own journey on identity, discovering or learning that the world is not as we see it, that the world is more complicated, more layered, more nuanced, and trying to add to that complication, that already complicated human situation, how we have two eyes that look forward and we never actually get to see our own faces. Every sense of self is a reflection. It's either what somebody told you are or what a mirror told you are. So if it's a mirror you saw in a boutique, fashion shop, it would tell you are slimmer than you actually are because it suits their purposes to do that. If it's your car's rearview mirror, it tells you you're actually closer than you actually are because it wants to keep you safe. So every sense of self is actually received information. So, for example, when I was a student in university and studying Black literature, basically all the places we ended up at as Black people, through slavery, through whatever, and how our language evolved with it. And then, of course, so that makes you become very Pan-Africanist in how you think and see the world. And then one day in conversation with my dad, he casually mentions, oh, by the way, do you know why your mother's name is Alexandrina Wolf? And I'm like, no. And he said, have you ever been curious? And then you discover that you actually come from a family that used to benefit from the slave trade. And growing up, all the rhetoric was that we were the victims and they did it to us. It was a very one-sided story. And then at some point you discover, oh, it's actually way more complicated than that. Way, way more complicated than that. So these are the reasons why I photograph. To learn, I'm curious. I love people. When I think of the places I enjoyed the most, the places I would love to go again, normally I think of the people I met, the people I experienced it with. So I think photographing people or meeting people and hearing their stories, those things come very naturally to me. So I end up being a people photographer. I end up listening to people's stories.
I think that that's all really interesting. And I love what you said there as well about, just complexity, the complexity of things. I'd like to know, what are different ways that you have found as a photographer that you can show complexity through photography? Or how do you get into the complexity of different issues as a photographer?
Stephen R. Covey has a book, 7 Habits of Highly Effective People, and he has these 7 paradigm shifts that need to happen if you want to be a highly effective person. And I think the second one is seek first to understand, then to be understood. I think the secret to good photography, when you're dealing with very nuanced, very complex issues, is not focus on the photography, just focus on understanding. Focus on getting to this place where the people can truly be themselves in your presence, when they can actually drop their masks and be comfortable and say, this is me, this is who I really, really, really am. Sometimes when that happens, you discover that you cannot share that photograph with the world. You cannot share that story with the world, because being the photographer and knowing more about the world in that sense, you know that it can come back and bite them. They may not be able to handle the repercussions of that if the whole world was to get to know. So sometimes you bury photographs. It's a decision you make. It's a responsibility you take for getting in there and asking too many questions or winning trust, for example. Yeah. But seeking first to understand, then to be understood is a good principle.
Absolutely. No, I really like that. I think that is a really good point, because it also, I think, encourages maybe people to approach situations with a more open mind.
Yes. And if there's a second point I'd want to add to that, it will be to seek to disappear, to seek to not get in the way of the story. I think at the pinnacle of all art is invisibility. If somebody sings really well, it is the song that touches your soul. And then after experiencing the song, you ask, who was that? Who was that? But if somebody tries singing, you can tell when people try too hard. They ruin it for everyone, and I see that with photography also. Some photographers just try too hard. And I think when you are telling very complex stories, considering that the stories are already complex, you want to disappear. You want to get out of the way as much as possible for the story to tell itself. And that probably is the harder task.
Yeah, I think that is quite complicated, isn't it? And I guess I wonder, how do you bring into the consideration the position of the photographer, like who the photographer is in relationship to the story that they're telling, especially in light of that idea of not getting in the way?
Some things wouldn't change. Like one of my favorite photographers and also a friend is Kadir. Kadir is Dutch, Van Leuzen, and Kadir is tall. He's much taller than me. Just our point of view when we look at the same thing will be different. As a person who is quite socially awkward, what will attract me at the same event, in the same experience, will be different. Who I would approach and how I will approach them will be different. So even without trying, I will always be present. See, so when I talk about disappearing, it is in the moments when the artist or the photographer feels compelled to show how creative they are or how skillful they are or how talented they are, and they take over the interview and, yeah, no. You don't have to do that. By disappearing, you'll be present.
Yeah, sort of not centering yourself, I guess,
Yes.
as well in the story.
Yes.
Yeah. And one of the ways that I first came across you and your work was in an interview that you did with Danielle Viasana at the start of the pandemic. It was called The Baggage That Lives With You Forever, and we'll link to it in the show notes. But I just was really struck by your analysis of the way that the COVID pandemic was being portrayed in Europe compared to the photographs that we have seen from sort of the continent of Africa and the different ways that illness has been depicted. And I was wondering if you wanted to speak to that a little bit, or if you could speak to that or share some thoughts about that.
I think it began with me being on BBC and seeing the headline 3,000 people have died in Italy from COVID-19. And I was like, 3,000 people, where are the photos? Because I'm used to Ebola hit Sierra Leone, and then you go online and you see all these photos, and I was like, where are the photos? So it was from just a genuine curiosity, like 3,000 people have died from this. Where are the journalists? Where are they? Because I see them in Africa. I see them in Africa. I have Italian photojournalist friends and colleagues. So where are the photos? And then in the process of me asking, I started hearing their stories. They are not being given access. They are being censored. They are being restricted. The government was deliberately making it extremely difficult for them to make the photos. I was like, okay. So how come Africa is photographed and treated differently? And I think it is because they understand the impact of the photograph. I often reference, I think Keith's poem Ode to a Grecian Urn. There's this English poet from just about 5 years before daguerreotype was invented. And he had this poem where he describes this Grecian urn, and on it you have this lover playing a harp or a flute, and you can see that they are in love, and the song will never end, because he's playing, and he can never stop playing because it's a drawing, right? And then you can see these two lovers who are about to kiss, but then they will never get to kiss, but they will always be in love, and he captures the immortality of the frozen image. And shortly after that, the first camera was invented. And I like to think of, because human beings we've always been obsessed with eternity, the concept of we living forever. In almost every major religion of the world, you have gods and demigods and saints and people who have transcended death and live forever. It is our deepest obsession as humans. And a photograph is a byproduct of that pursuit. So when you photograph a child who is starving and dying, maybe they lived, maybe they became president of their nation, but nobody remembers that. All we ever remember is a poor, starving African child. If you photograph a woman at her most humiliating, most embarrassing point in life, probably just 2 minutes before she was great, and maybe a year after that, she was phenomenal, but we don't see that. It is just the part of her life that got immortalized, that got frozen in time, we remember. And I think that if photojournalists or photographers will understand the long-term impact of their great images, maybe we'll be more careful, maybe we'll be more attentive. And sometimes I think, especially when it comes to images that are made about Africa, of Africans, I think that empathy or consideration tends to be missing.
Absolutely. And I guess, where do you situate sort of that responsibility as well of the photographer over the impact of their images? Because I've spoken with some photographers who feel more that their responsibility is to make the image and the impact comes later. And I've spoken with other photographers who feel that the impact is what drives their work. So I guess, in your understanding, what is our responsibility for our impact?
I think that's why I preferred becoming a documentary photographer to being a photojournalist, because with photojournalism, you just focus on that moment, the newsiest part, and that's it, and nobody asks before and nobody asks after. But normally with documentary photography, you take your time. At least you should take your time and tell us a longer story. And in the process of telling the longer story, you tend to be more fair, so you still get the impact, but then it's a more complete story, because people are more than just a moment you witnessed.
Absolutely. And I guess sort of the more long form storytelling allows more space for that complexity that you're talking about earlier, and more time maybe to get into the complexity. So I think that's a useful distinction, really, between the photojournalism and the documentary photography.
Yes.
On the topic of representation as well, I was looking at your website and you were doing a story on inequality. And I really appreciated something that you wrote about that photo story, about how you tried to avoid the trap of juxtaposing poverty porn and opulence. And I was wondering if you could speak a little bit about that decision, and how do you talk about inequality or show inequality in ways that maybe don't just replicate our stereotypes or expectations, or sort of the most extreme?
So one thing I have learned about life is that we are all actors, and the rich tend to pretend they are poor, and the poor tend to pretend they are rich. So if you just follow, for example, who lives in the fanciest house or drives the Porsche's car and all that, you actually may end up photographing a lot of really broke people. you know, and I know a lot of rich people who look like paupers if you don't know them. So, but understanding that, maybe even on a more serious note, that aside, on a more serious note, I think inequality is not hidden. So if you have to go out there to find it, if I have to get access to some exclusive party happening somewhere to find evidence of opulence, and if I have to find some remote area to find one malnourished child to find poverty, I'm not doing a good story on inequality. Inequality is in your face. All you have to do is really engage people and hear their story. Just ask the right questions and you'll be shocked. Most of the time, because people are trying to live in dignity, so there's nothing on the immediate surface that may give them away until you get into a conversation. And then you may discover even the shirt was borrowed. But I probably can afford to do this form of storytelling because I don't enter competitions for awards. And I think the stories that shock us, that are visually compelling to see, tend to be the ones that would win awards. But if you look beyond those and say, I want to leave a legacy where people 200 years from now who want to understand how Africa was, or who Ghanaians were, or who whatever group of people were, in my time, my work can give them the closest sense of the truth that they can find anywhere. And I think that in the effort to make exceptional images, we tend to distort history, especially for those who come after us. Because they may never know we never actually dressed like that. These were props, for a shoe. They may never know we actually never ate that, and the ability to see that the mundane is a story. But I think that's a bit more complicated, probably.
Wow, there's so much in that I think we could unpack. And I think that's just really interesting. I mean, the first thing that really struck me was, you were talking about how inequality is all around us and it's not in those sort of extreme places. It reminded me a little bit of something that I came across in the international development sector about how, there was a charity that I was speaking to who didn't want to share any photographs of migrant children holding cell phones because the perception was, well, if they had a cell phone, then they didn't really need help. It's what does inequality actually look like? And what does insecurity, housing insecurity or lack of access to services, like what does that look like? It doesn't necessarily look like not having a cell phone. So I think that's really interesting, that sort of digging into that you're describing through talking with people. And so I guess it makes me wonder, is captioning quite important to your work? For example, you're saying, someone might be wearing a shirt and it might be borrowed. You wouldn't know that looking at a photograph. So yeah, how does captioning, or how do you bring that sort of other knowledge into the story?
Captioning is critical. It is the one thing I'm also probably most lazy at. But I feel that captioning is the secret recipe that gives a photograph true longevity. It's that important. Captioning is crucial because captioning helped me step out of my bias to hear the original observer's voice. Who is this? Where was this? When? Why? What was happening? That cannot be changed because that's the information that came with it. So captioning is critical. Otherwise, like Anais Nin said, we don't see things as they are, we see things as we are. So we'd always look at the image and have our own biases and just move on quickly. But a caption has a way of bringing you back to the original substance of the photograph.
And I also wanted to ask you if you could maybe speak a little bit more to your decision not to enter awards. I think that that's a really interesting and, an ethical positioning that you have decided. And I was wondering if you could maybe talk about that.
So when I worked in advertising, my team won awards every single year. And we will create campaigns for clients, knowing we wanted to enter them into awards. So many times the client wasn't the consideration. Probably a cheaper shot would have worked, but because of that, fortunately, these clients can afford it. So it didn't feel like an ethical dilemma, you know. But when you're working in rural communities with vulnerable people, I don't want to make a strong image of you, so I win an award. I think it is unethical. It makes me the worst kind of vulture to see somebody suffering and say, how can I make a compelling award-winning image of this person? It changes me because sometimes the human thing to do is to put the camera down and just have a conversation with them. And I'm not saying it's wrong to enter awards. We're all different. Probably some people don't even think of awards at all. And then after their story is done, they go like, oh, maybe. Probably that's how many operate. But my brain doesn't work like that. You know, so for me, it was better to just say, no, I'm not entering awards. If some organization recognizes my work and decides to award me, that's great, but I'm not going to. It doesn't work for me. It changes how I approach the story. I would want the story to be more compelling. I'll tell them to hide their mobile phones. So they look poorer, they look more desperate. But the truth is that a lot of poor people have phones because China churns out a lot of cheap phones.
I think that's really interesting, the way that you're describing, you know, how if you are seeking out the award or if your intention is to submit, it impacts your storytelling. I think that's a really important point. Are there any other ethical dilemmas that you encounter in your work as a documentary photographer that you could sort of describe for us and tell us a little bit about how you navigate that?
I think for me, the biggest one is consent. I doubt if they're truly vulnerable can give consent. For example, let's say an NGO doing great things in a community that is really deprived gives a single mother of four who's been struggling, gives her a bag of seeds to plant. And later on, they send me there and say, oh, she's one of our beneficiaries. We want you to interview her. They give her seeds to plant. How can she say no? How can she truly say no? There is a point in life when people can be so vulnerable that if we truly want to protect them, we won't use the consent excuse. You know, we would have deeper conversations with them beyond the whole thing of consent. The consent will be more ethical and moral. Like I'll talk to my grandma, oh, you know, this photo I'm making of you, yes, it's for these people. But the truth is, once it goes on the internet, I don't know where it will end up and who will use it. Maybe it will bring you a lot of good luck. Actually, if you don't like the photos, we can even throw them away. It's fine. And she does, oh, it's not a big deal. My son is not a big deal. You know you have consent, you know. But sometimes you can tell they have questions, but they'll sign the form because they can't afford to say no. And so I think that we need to have new conversations on consent. What I tell people when I try to describe extreme poverty and how it takes away our agency, I use a story of a married woman, you know, from a decent family, would normally take great pride in her sense of chastity and fidelity or commitment to her husband. You know, she takes pride in that. If you were to compare her to a sex worker, she would be very, 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 very offended because she's somebody's wife. But if that same person finds herself extremely vulnerable and, you know, she can't afford to pay rent, her children are sick, if she doesn't cough up some money, one probably might die. And then there is this neighbor who is very kind and always comes to her aid and is always there for her. And one day, you know, makes her know that he actually likes her in a way he shouldn't like her as somebody's wife. Do you think her no will be as strong in that situation, under those circumstances, as it would be if she was just fine? You know, if she and her husband are great, they're fine, everything is fine. You know, so poverty has a way of weakening your voice. There's an old quote that says, when the yoke is heavy, even the righteous will lay their hands on iniquity. When it gets really tough, even good people will do bad things to survive. It's what it is. So consent for me is a complicated matter, especially when we're working with vulnerable groups.
Yeah, absolutely. And I thought it was really interesting that you used an example there, of if you were, I think you said if you were photographing your grandmother, for example.
Yes.
And it reminded me of something also that you said in that article with Danielle Viasana about how people don't make sort of graphic photographs of themselves. And yes. I thought that was a really interesting point. Do you want to expand on that at all?
When you take any of the famous photojournalists who have made these very voyeuristic, crazy pictures, let them show you their family photos. The photos they took of their own children, of their own spouse. When Sally Mann was making photos of her kids running around naked, which from a parent's perspective is actually an everyday scene. If you have wild kids, it's not sexual at all. And even for her as a woman, in an era when that was a very common sight, people considered her work complicated, and she had many critics for her kind of work, And that tells you that that is not how most of us photograph our families or want our families to be photographed. So what makes it okay then to photograph another's family that way? Empathy is probably one of the most important virtues we all should have, we all should develop. The ability to just pause for a moment and ask, if that was my daughter, would I be happy with that? If that was my son, if that was my sister.
Those ideas of, empathy and consent and sort of other ethical considerations that you bring into your practice, how did you come to those for yourself? Or what were the resources that were useful to you? Or was it more just following your gut on things?
A long time ago, I read someone say, every photograph is a self-portrait. I think once I understood that, I realized that I have to be responsible. Interestingly, as a person, I have actually always been fascinated, for example, by nudity. This whole concept where we think we have to put on clothes before we are beautiful. I don't get it. I think we are probably the only creatures, maybe us and some snails, we are the only creatures who think that way. I have to put something over and come before we are, no, I think we are beautiful. We also live in society, and I think that ability to understand, it's a little more complicated. For example, if I photograph a young woman in the nude and she doesn't care, in many society, it will very directly affect her prospect of getting married or not. This is just the world we live in, it's just what it is. And so if she wants to be photographed and I want to photograph her, then it becomes my responsibility to still protect her. So how do I photograph her in such a way that we both enjoy the art, but then she has to tell you that is her before you can make her out? My not making it obviously her is my gift to her, my way of protecting her. I think being a creator must come with responsibilities. Maybe as I get older, I become more sensitive to these things. Maybe my faith is also a factor, but I doubt it. I think a lot of it should just be commonsensical also. Pause and ask yourself, why do you want to make the photograph? And answer yourself, the ancient Greeks, they'll tell you that anytime we're entering the temple of Apollos, you'll see a sign on the wall that said, man, know thyself. Not be honest, just why do I want to photograph her? Why is it urgent? Why can't it wait? If we can answer those questions honestly, I think we become better photographers. We may not win any awards, but we do become better photographers.
Absolutely. The last question I like to ask everyone who comes on the podcast is, what does photography ethics mean to you?
Photography ethics for me means if I can go back, show them the photographs and not have to worry about how they will feel about it. It may not be their greatest photo, but they say, at least that's how I was feeling. That's where I was. I don't want to remember that part of my history again, but that photograph is honest. It speaks to that moment in my life. I'll be happy.
Thank you very much for listening to this episode of the Photo Ethics Podcast. The aim of this podcast is to share new insights about photography ethics with others. So if you heard something you liked, please share this podcast with someone who would appreciate it. You can also rate and review us on Spotify or Apple Podcasts. This episode of the Photo Ethics Podcast is sponsored by Falmouth University, one of the UK's leading creative arts universities. In a world where images shape narratives, ethical photography has never been more important. At Falmouth University, the online photography MA helps you master your craft while exploring the responsibilities of visual storytelling. Learn from industry experts, challenge conventions, and develop work with integrity, all from almost anywhere in the world. Join a global community of photographers committed to making a difference. Search Falmouth online and book a call with a course advisor today. Join me next week when we hear from Heather Ajapong on embodiment and the self.